Hello, everybody. Welcome to Legends of Business News, SABEW's conversation series with the pioneers and trailblazers of business journalism. I'm Caleb Silver, the president of SABEW and the editor-in-chief of SABEW, and we are so delighted to have you with us this evening as we honor Diana Henriques, one of the brightest stars of our industry. Diana is a best-selling author multiple times, a staff writer for the New York Times from 1989 to 2012, and a contributing writer ever since then. Her career has been largely focused on investigative reporting on white-collar crime, market regulation, and corporate governance, and no one, and I mean no one, does it better. She was the first journalist to have interviewed Bernie Madoff while he was in prison. Then she wrote the book Wizard of Lies, and then appeared as herself in HBO's adaptation of that book alongside Robert De Niro. So if that doesn't make you a legend, nothing does. She was a Pulitzer finalist and has won every big award in our industry, including SABEW's Distinguished Achievement Award. And we don't just give that one away. That's for very special people. And she's been a mentor and an inspiration to so many journalists along the way. Heavy hitters like Diana require heavy hitters to interview her. So we called in a swatter. Larry Ingrassia is also a best-selling author and has worked as a senior managing editor and at the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Wall Street Journal. He's won all the big awards in our industry as well, and he's mentored and led hundreds of journalists along the way as well. He's also a recipient of our Distinguished Achievement Award. As I said, we don't just give this out to everybody. So you know how we feel about him, and we know that he and Diana Henriques know each other well from their time together at the New York Times. So it's an honor for SABEW to be able to bring together the brightest stars in our industry, as I said, to honor Diana and to have this conversation series. And we thank you so much for being here, Diana. We thank you, Larry. I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do now, get out of the way, get a nice glass of red wine, sit back and enjoy this conversation as we honor Diana Henriques, a true legend in our industry. So you can take it away, Larry. Take it from here.
Thank you, Caleb. It's a pleasure being asked to interview Diana, but not as much as the pleasure it was of being her last boss when she was at the New York Times. Working with reporters like Diana are what make the business so interesting and fun. She was ambitious, she was excited, and despite many, many years doing this, she wasn't grizzled. She was tough but fair, and I've worked with a lot of great reporters over the years, and Diana was one of my favorites easily. So I'm so happy to be doing this. Why don't we start at the beginning, Diana? Why journalism? What got you interested in becoming a reporter?
It was a blow to the heart. I don't know the French for that. I was working in a junior achievement program in Roanoke, Virginia, and they had a gig going with our local newspaper, and a girlfriend persuaded me to sign up for it. I liked it. I liked writing. I never tried it before. I never thought of being a journalist, but I did it. And our advisor, who was I now know, nearly semi-retired television editor of the paper, and this was what he did in his spare time. He had done some edits on a piece that I had written and asked me to rewrite it along those lines. So he found me an empty desk in the newsroom of the Roanoke Times and World News.
Wow.
One of those big old oak desks with the bolted in typewriter that rolled up when you flipped it. And I was sitting there tapping away on the typewriter, and the newsroom for the morning paper started just to come to life around me. The bells on the teletype machine and the typewriters of the guys all around me, and the burnt coffee smell and the rubber cement smell and the pneumatic tubes thumping into the bins. And I looked up, I looked across this room, and I said, this is where I belong. This is home. And it was truly, my mother said, I got in the car when she picked me up that evening, just starry-eyed that this was what I wanted to do.
Wow.
And probably, you go into newsrooms today, they're like insurance offices, right? There's no noise, the phones don't ring. It's just, but I fell in love with the symphony of that old-fashioned newsroom.
It was pretty fascinating. I remember those days. Now, your first job was with the New York Times, right?
No, sir. No, my first paid job, I wrote in high school for the local paper, and then helped edit my college paper. I'm a big campus journalism fan. But my first paid job was for one of the weekly papers owned by the Princeton Packet. Now, it must be said at that time, the saint in our industry, Barney Kilgore, owned that was his little like Jeff Bezos thing. He owned the Princeton Packet papers, and they ran little weekly papers in all of the communities around and about Princeton. And I was the editor, chief, reporter, photographer, editorial page editor, chief cook, and bottle washer for one of those little weeklies. And just loved it. Absolutely loved local journalism. And that I spent a couple of years there having a heck of a good time. And then someone I met in the community I cover, one of the local League of Women Voters activists, was married to an Asbury Park Press reporter. And he had noticed my work and recommended me when they had an opening. So that was the next step up. So it climbed up from weekly to a regional daily to a bigger daily to eventually the New York Times.
And how important were those different steps along the way? Did you learn different things? Were they important to the reporter you became?
Good question. I mean, the acid test of journalism is local journalism. You make a mistake, your editor hears about it before you've sat down at your desk. You know, it enforces a carefulness, a focus on accuracy that I don't think necessarily happens if you start off in a great big paper, or even worse, a wire service. You don't get that feedback. So yeah, one of the early lessons was check, and then check again. When I got to the regional daily working for the Asbury Park Press in their courthouse bureau, a county courthouse bureau, that was incredibly educational. Not just because it was a form of government where you could see all the levers. I mean, you could see where everything was. It was like the national government writ little, a microcosm of that. So it was great for learning how things work, but that's also where I learned the glories of the filed document. I was the only woman in the Freehold Bureau. Mm-hmm. I was the only woman who'd ever worked in the Freehold Bureau of the Asbury Park Press. And the way a lot of my very talented colleagues got their stories was schmoozing with the cops and the sheriffs. You know, they'd sit in the hot tub down by the beach and pick up the latest news from the county political cronies, and then go back and get all these wonderful scoops. This was not a path I could easily take. I was happily married, 53 years now, but I was married. I had that was just not how I could do it. I discovered through a tip that I'd gotten that led me to a story about land transfers in advance of a new highway interchange. One of the perennial corruption problems. County officials knowing where the exchange is going to be and buying up the property. Well, to do that, I had to figure out how to trace land records, title records, deeds and mortgages and that sort of thing. These wonderful title searchers at the Hall of Records, which happened to be right next door to the Bureau, just took me, I show up, dewy-eyed, I'd love to learn how to do this. And they showed me how to trace these records. And that was really when I discovered how a facility for tracking down documents.
Documents don't lie. That's the other bit.
Documents don't lie, and documents lie on a level playing field.
Yes.
The documents don't care if you're a girl or a boy. The documents don't care what color you are or how old you are. Documents level the playing field, and they did for me at a time when the playing field was a little,
tilted.
Not yet level.
Let's say it was tilted.
Yeah. So that was the big lesson from there, and then it was not that long. My next job, the lesson was don't ever be a copy editor, because I was a copy editor and hated it for 2 years. But then after that, I went to work for the Trenton Times in the capital city newspaper. And that's where I first got my first taste of investigative reporting.
Yeah, tell us about that. how did you make that transition, or was it logical because you'd been building up to that moment?
No, it was so illogical that when I got this tip, and I still don't know why the guy ever called me. I must have written something that was tangentially related to what he wanted to blow the whistle on. But when I got this tip, I actually went to the investigative editor at the Trenton Times, a wonderful man named John Colasar, to whom I owe an enormous debt. And I said to John, I said, well, I've got this tip, and I don't do investigations, so I'll be happy to hand it off. And he said, no, I mean, go ahead, run with it.
And what was the tip?
And it was about cronyism in one of the state's big revenue bond agencies, the Housing Finance Authority in New Jersey. And it was the beginning, that phone call was the beginning of a 2-year journey into the revenue bond world, with some successful prosecutions and some adventures along the way with process servers and private detectives on my tail. I mean, it was very exciting. But that was my first real taste of investigative reporting, and I loved it. But that was government corruption. That's kind of where I thought I was going to be going. Was in the world of government corruption, and that investigation led to a 1-year fellowship at Princeton that really pointed me in the direction of public finance. I mean, how governments fund themselves, how they work, and that took me to the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I wasn't there for very long before they had an opening in their Wall Street bureau, which, curiously enough, nobody wanted. Nobody wanted.
Let's face it. Back then, if you were an up-and-coming reporter, you pretty much wanted to be a political reporter, right?
Well, you did.
Or maybe a sports reporter, but
yeah, right. But it also, if you were at the Philadelphia Inquirer, you didn't want to be that far away from the legendary Gene Roberts. Right. That Wall Street was way too far away from the newsroom for the people who loved working for Gene. Right. And so I, put my hand up, already, kind of in love with the municipal bond market, and went up to our Wall Street bureau. It looked out on an air shaft in an old office building at 80 Wall Street. And my source of market news was 1010 Wins Radio. So that was how primitive it was. But covered that. I was there from 85 until I joined Barron's in 86, and then from Barron's to the New York Times. And at Barron's, what was the lesson there? My God, I worked beside Floyd Norris. I mean, he was my personal private MBA program. I would stay up all night reading, corporate financial documents, registration statements, annual reports, Post-it notes with all my questions. Floyd would come in the next morning, sit down in my office, and explain it all to me. I mean, I would have fallen flat on my face at Barron's.
I think that's a good lesson there, Diana, which is, and I think any successful journalist, probably any successful person, has learned at some point in time, which is, especially when you're young, there's a lot that you don't know, or you don't know how to do. And if you're smart, you recognize that. You know what you don't know. Yeah. And you also kind of connect yourself to somebody who does. You adopt them or get them to adopt you. Yes. And it probably, I'm sure that Floyd, I know Floyd, kind of brilliant mind, but he's only going to adopt somebody who he thinks really is passionate about the stuff that the way that's another way to get adopted, right?
Right. Well, the first thing you have to do, and you've hit on it, Larry, first thing you have to do is ask for help. And when you're new in a job, it's often very tempting to want to be, master of the universe. There's nothing I don't know about this job. I'm here. I'm ready. Throw me in anywhere. And so
why show a weakness? Why show a weakness? Right?
So the first thing you need to do is to find someone to whom you can trustingly say, I need help. And can you help me? And that, it wasn't like I really thought that would be a good thing to do. It was that or completely fall flat on my face. I mean, the kind of corporate stories that I had done at the Philadelphia Inquirer, you typically you call 5 or 6 Wall Street analysts who covered the company. You call the company's PR office. You call maybe a couple of competitors, and you'd write the story. Well, at Barron's, you could not let anyone know you were even doing the story, or it would start moving the market and the stock. And if that stock started to move while you were reporting on it, Alan Abelson would spike the story, period. And if it could be 15 minutes before the Friday night deadline, if that stock started to move, he'd kill the story. So I had no idea how to navigate in a world of market moving information. And that was the key thing that Barron's taught me, was to be very aware of the value of the news we handle, and the vested interests that surround you when you're working in that milieu.
I want to ask you about some of your favorite stories and toughest stories that you've worked on. But let me ask you another question before we get that. How, as an investigative journalist, do you be tough but fair? Because I've seen you in action, and you know where the line is, where you have to be fair. And I've seen other reporters who aren't exactly sure where the line is. And when you're dealing with bad people, why should you be fair?
Right. Yeah. Well, the primary reason to be fair is if you're wrong, you want to know it before you publish. And these are the people who can catch you, right? I mean, if I've worked with some of the best investigative reporters in the world, by which I mean Dean Baquet, when he came to the Times from the Chicago Tribune, by which I mean David Barstow, my dear friend, with whom I was so honored to work. They're not nasty people, they're charming people, and they manage to be tough and relentless without being rude. There's a big difference between being tough and being rude. I've known rude reporters who were not tough. They were rude, but they never saw what the really key question would be.
Right.
What would be the question that this guy doesn't want to answer, that you just missed asking because you annoyed him with your previous question. So I think it is a tough line. You're right. And certainly the world of social media and what would you call it? The kind of ill-tempered dialogue that seems to dominate our modern setting makes it harder to find that balance. But for me, the key thing was, if you are being rude and they're getting mad, you're not going to learn what you need to know. You're going to get angry. Emotions are going to enter into it, and it's just going to fog the facts that you need to find. And as I said, the bottom line for letting the target of your story or the subject of your story have his or her say is to save you if you're wrong. I mean, to save you if you've made a mistake. You want to learn that in the interview. You do not want to learn that the day it's in the paper.
Right. So talk about some of your favorite stories. I think I know some of them, but you've had so many. And how did you get the ideas? And then, kind of how long did it take for them to kind of come to life in print?
Well, I mean, sometimes obviously they're tips. I mean, probably the body of work I'm proudest of were the stories in the mid 2000s, the mid aughts, that focused on financial ripoffs of American service people, service members, and that came in as a tip about contractual plan mutual funds being marketed to the military. Now, I actually written a book about mutual funds. I mean, I'd written Fidelity's World, which is about the history of mutual funds, and I knew contractual plans were a constant source of scandal in the industry. They were such a bad deal for investors that they just kind of disappeared from the civilian market. So it was kind of like you told me, hey, they're selling dinosaurs down at the pet store. I said, don't be ridiculous. No one would buy these. Oh yeah, they're being sold in the military. So I start pursuing that. I've got enough body of knowledge that I knew it would be a fairly fast turnaround. I went to my editor at the time, Glenn Cramen, one of the loveliest people, and I said, I think, give me 3-4 weeks. I don't know anything about this company that's supposed to be selling these things, but there's not going to be a lot else I'm going to need to know. And he said, fine. So I started looking into this company, and oddly, there's not a firm on Wall Street that doesn't have a list of investor complaints against them, because investors complain about anything.
Right.
I didn't get my statement on time. They complain. This company had what looked like an absolutely clean record, and
Wow.
I was stymied to find out anything about them. And the wonderful researcher who worked with the business news department at that time, Donna Anderson, managed to find on Lexis somewhere a mention of this company in the footnotes of a big report on ripoffs of service members by insurance companies.
Huh.
It had been written by a retired chief judge of the Army. He'd been tasked with investigating it. And here they are down in the footnote. Well, I'm reading the rest of the report and I'm saying, oh my hair is on fire. Oh, this is unbelievable. So, I go to Larry. I said, well, you want me to do the mutual fund thing and then dig into this, or you get our insurance people to build it? He said, no. This is, it's the service members who are our story.
Right.
Here. It's not who's ripping them off. It's that they're being ripped off before we send them into war.
Yeah.
And this was when up-tempo shipment, deployments to Iraq were a daily matter. So now that complicated things. I didn't know anything about insurance. I mean, truly nothing. Term insurance, I vaguely understood because we had some, but other than that. So that really became a deep education. And it took me into advance payments on veterans pensions. It took me into payday loans. I mean, it led me into a whole lot of directions, and it also led me on to Planet Military, where the culture and the protocols were so different from any world I'd ever covered before. So
you must have you've got a lot of pushback, right? Initially from the
enormous pushback before the stories even ran.
Yeah,
they're in the office. They're insisting I have no idea what I'm talking about. A lot of pushback, but there also just tremendous impact. I mean, when the first of those stories ran, the reader reaction shut down my inbox in my email.
Wow.
I mean, it just hit a spark. It was the right story at the right moment. And, within weeks, there are congressional hearings. Within months, there are legislative reforms. There insurance regulators in the multiple states went into action. There were cash rebates, cash refunds for insurance premiums for thousands of troops who had paid them without realizing what they were doing.
How gratifying.
I got on the phone one afternoon. I learned about the Civil Relief Act, which is a law that goes back to Abraham Lincoln that protects service members from certain kinds of civil process. And I learned one afternoon, I got a frantic call from a lawyer who I'd heard about. I'd dealt with him before. He had a military wife there in Ohio whose home was about to be foreclosed because her husband was actively deployed in Iraq. And so I'm getting on the phone to the bank and saying, hello, this is who I am. I want to know if you're familiar with the Service Member Civil Relief Act. Saved her home, stopped the foreclosure. So as I said, one of the most satisfying, gratifying projects that I've ever done. I learned a lot, but I think I helped a lot too. And you just often don't get to have those two things in tandem. So that would be right up at the top of the list for favorite stories that I've done. And
tell us about your acting career.
God, that was like a chapter in someone else's life that got dropped into my memoir. I mean, it just never looked for at all. I was thrilled when HBO optioned Wizard of Oz. I mean, that came through within weeks of publication. And De Niro's interest in the project was what brought HBO in. So that, yeah, I'd actually been on a conference call with Robert De Niro and figured that was as good as it was going to get. Yeah, I could ask for nothing more. I'd heard him on the phone. He's phoning in from Louisiana or somewhere. He's on set, and he's saying, "Diana," I said, "Yes, Mr. De Niro." He said, "Diana, I am Bernie Madoff," and so like he had to sell me on him playing the part. So what did I know?
How did you get the interview with Madoff in the first place? I mean, that was such a coup, and I remember the moment, and we talked about that.
It was
but
was
still,
craziness.
kind of that's what everybody wanted. He wasn't talking about what was it that kind of you think persuaded him to give Diana Henriques this interview?
Well, I would say three things, just off the top of my head. First of all, the superlative quality of my colleagues. The New York Times coverage of the Madoff scandal.
Led by you.
Well, I had 48 shared bylines during that period of time. So there was a hell of a lot of contributors there, and I bless every one of them. They were fair. They checked things out. They didn't go with unsubstantiated rumors. The editors who would get a call at 11 o'clock saying the New York Post is saying this, or even the Wall Street Journal is saying that, and they'd wake me up and say, "Do we need to match it?" And I would say, "It's not true. That's just not true." And they would say, "Fine," and let it go. I mean, that kind of integrity let me at least attempt an interview. If I'd been working for some other publications I could name, it would have been no from the get-go. So that gave me an opportunity to ask. Second, never burn a source and always stay in touch. Ike Sorkin had been a source of mine for 15 years. I had known him. He had represented a whole host of con men that I'd written about. I had always tried to be fair with him, and we had a good relationship. I had all his home phone numbers. So he was Bernie's attorney. And I just, thank whatever journalism gods were looking over my shoulder that he would be the one of all white collar defense lawyers. He would be the one that would get Bernie's call, because I knew him and he knew me. And I felt if I could persuade anybody to let me talk to Madoff, it would be Ike. And then, then finally, I think it was that I knew the history of Bernie Madoff. I knew the Bernie Madoff he was proud of being. I had covered Bernie for years before anybody else had, in journalism had heard of him. He was a major behind the scenes figure in how the plumbing of Wall Street worked, the machinery of Wall Street. And he was proud of what he'd done, what he contributed to the formation of NASDAQ and what he contributed to the Securities Clearing Corporation and all the things that he'd done. He was proud of that. And he knew I knew that about him. I hadn't discovered Bernie Madoff the day he was arrested. I knew the Bernie, I knew the Dr. Jekyll as well as the Mr. Hyde. And I think those three things were what ultimately, and persistence. I wrote him a letter in prison asking for an interview every month.
Right.
And then in the fall of 2009, I got a letter back. I got a call. My husband called me at work and said, "There's a letter from Bernie Madoff in the mail to you." So I race home to see what it says. And it's not an acceptance, but it's our first personal contact.
Right.
And I continued to write him. And eventually the following spring, he decided to talk with me. So, and the pitch I would make in the months, other Madoff books were coming out, in which he was little more than a cartoon character. And I said, that's going to be the story that goes down through history if you don't talk to me. I mean, you haven't contributed your dimension to any of these other books, and that's how it's going to be if you don't give me a chance.
I want to continue on this, but if anybody out there has any questions for Diana, please put them in chat, and I'll take a look and pass them along.
Great. Yeah, so I think ultimately he decided that it's, to talk with me. And
did he try to control the interview? What was?
I think he initially did. He came in with a little agenda. I mean, when we sat down in the visitor room, Ike and me and Madoff, he pulled a little scrap of paper out of his shirt pocket and opened it up. It's like he had points that he wanted to make. However, I was a woman on a mission. You could not take in a tape recorder. You could not take anything except a tablet and a pen and a few sheets of paper that the Bureau of Prisons had to approve in advance. And I had 2 hours, only 2 hours. So first thing I did was cut a deal with Ike. I said, listen, don't interrupt me to object. If I asked a question you didn't want him to answer, tell me later. I'll take it out. I'll put it off the record retroactively, but do not interrupt the interview. I don't have enough time.
Right.
I didn't have enough time for Bernie's agenda either. So I just jumped right into my questions. And once you get a con man talking about himself, thank God for the power of narcissism. I mean, it just flowed. So I was so fiercely focused on what he was saying and what he was doing and what the sounds and visions were around me, that I had no time for whatever he might have wanted to talk about. I had my list of questions that I had to get through. So it was an exhausting experience.
So we have a question here, and it says, as a journalist who knows the value of source-based reporting, you've talked a little bit. Can you see it?
Yeah. Can you share some lessons about cultivation and building trust? The first thing, I think it's helpful to speak the language. And that's a cliche, I know, but that Planet Military experience was a case in point. In the military world, emails are extremely formal. That it's, good morning, Ms. Henriques. I hope you had a nice weekend. I've received your request to interview the staff people at Fort Bragg. I'm endeavoring to said I hope to be able to notify you of that end of business Friday, blah, blah, blah. Respectfully yours, Sergeant so-and-so. Well, you don't just tap back, K, happy to do that. I realized, okay, respond in kind. Thank you very much, Sergeant so-and-so. So I got into the language, the culture, the protocols of that world. Every profession has its separate culture, whether you're talking to accountants, whether you're talking to venture capitalists, whether you're talking to short sellers, whether you're talking to nonprofits. They all have a culture, a way of speaking, a way of talking. And if you're alert and pick up on that and use it, mirror it back, I think that tells them you care enough about paying. First of all, you're paying attention. They can see that you're paying attention,
right,
and you care enough about respecting their values. So I think that's one good tip, is to mirror the culture, master the language, and use it. But also, I think you have to have a clear idea in your own mind of what common ground you can find with this source. I mean, why should they talk to us? Why should any source talk to a reporter? You and I both know that everyone's life will be easier and quieter and more pleasant if they never talk to a journalist, right? But so why should they talk to us? And if you are clear in your own mind what's in the public interest, how they can serve the public interest, then I think it fortifies you in terms of making your case.
Well, the line that you gave about Bernie Madoff, and it's in your interest to talk to me because this is going to be the definitive book, and you want at least your view. You don't have any control over it, but you want your view reflected in the definitive book. Another question: what's the most important thing for students of business journalism to learn? And I guess the way I was going to phrase that is I'm a young reporter. I want to be the Diana Henriques of my generation. How do I make that happen?
Wow. Step one, master your fear. I have never to this day picked up the phone to cold call someone for information without having my stomach hurt. I mean, to this day, I hate making cold calls to potential sources. I've had to master that fear over a half century of working as a reporter. So, don't give in to that fear. But the second thing I would say is learn all the time. Always be learning. No acquaintance is ever wasted on a journalist. No business card should ever be thrown in the trash. You just never know when you're going to need that. So collect people, collect expertise, collect it, keep it fresh. That really worked for me. You're staying in touch with sources after the story, a year after the story, so that you have an ongoing relationship with the people that you've written and worked about. I think that certainly contributed a lot to my career, and I can point to half a dozen stories where that was the key factor, like the relationship with Ike Sorkin being just one example of that. But then the third thing, and you know how passionate I am about this, so I don't know if it was the subject of a later topic, but learn the minutes of the last meeting. I am so passionately convinced that financial history is the very best friend of a budding financial journalist. When I went into financial journalism from government coverage, I had to learn from scratch. I didn't know where the stock exchange was, physically where it was. So I had to learn, and learning about the history of the markets or the history of the industry you cover or the history of the figures you cover is indisputably, without question, that was my edge. That awareness of what had happened before. After a while, there's not a lot new under the sun. That was really the
It seems to me that also kind of helps one of your other points. If you know that stuff and your subject knows that stuff, they're going to respect you a little bit more.
That's a good point. It is a way to respect.
You're not like somebody coming in that they're kind of, this don't even know kind of the basics of the history of what she's or he's asking about.
Right. I agree with you. I think it shows that you understand, what happened before, how we got here. It's maybe I'm just focusing on that as kind of a key element of what helped me do what I wanted to do, because I love financial history and I write financial history. But it's from the heart. I really do believe that if we as journalists can be more respectful of the history of the institutions and the businesses and the country that we're covering, we'll do it better.
Another question, and I'll expand on this one a little bit. Why do you think Madoff got away with his scam for so many decades? And why did he decide to turn to the dark side? And I would ask more broadly, is that the fault of the press? Is the press kind of to blame for, or what role could the press have helped in stopping the 2008 financial crisis by, kind of recognizing some of the danger signs before, even though I thought we wrote about a lot of them, maybe not.
And we did. I mean, really, I'm always reminded that we need to be a little bit humble about how much we can, in fact, affect the path of history. By the time the 2008 crisis came along, we had about 8 years of political leadership in this country that was denigrating the reliability of the press every 5 minutes. I mean, yes, I'm old enough to remember Spiro Agnew and his attacks on the press. They were nothing compared to what happened after 2000. Right. And it coincided with a time of great economic stress for American journalism as well. So, it wasn't like the American public was turning to us with great trust and great avidity to learn what we could teach them about what the heck was going on. Because there was some tremendously great journalism done in advance of the 2008 crisis. And And we all want to believe that if everyone had just read all our stories, it would have been different. But everyone didn't read our stories, and some people who read our stories poo-pooed them.
Right.
I like to remind people, that money isn't red or blue. Money is green. You got to get that. It's not red or blue, and it's not a partisan question. But inevitably, there's nothing in the country's discourse today that doesn't become a partisan question.
And as far as Madoff and how he got away with it for so long?
Yeah, let's talk about that, because one thing we forget about con men is how good they are. I mean, if you really how good they are. If you can't win somebody's trust and keep it in the face of 1,000 red flags, you need to go into another line of crime. I mean, hijack automobiles or something else. Don't try to run a Ponzi scheme. Because by definition, a Ponzi schemer is highly successful, highly admired, and highly trusted in his community, or he can't run a Ponzi scheme. You do not give your trust fund to Donald Trump to manage for you. You give it to someone that you trust. And so one of the reasons it lasts so long, one of the reasons that all Ponzi schemes get started and roll along is the capacity of the con man to instill trust and to deflect questions and skepticism. So that was part of it. And unfortunately, that same blind spot afflicted our regulators as well during that period of time, hard-pressed and underpaid though they all were. One of the SEC investigators investigating Madoff had been out of law school for 19 months. I mean, we weren't exactly fielding the varsity team against a con man as brilliant as Madoff. Madoff was also able, just from a sheer mathematics standpoint, Bernie never paid out huge returns. Most Ponzi schemes do. Right. And we all think that's the definition of a Ponzi scheme: double your money in 30 days, right? Pie in the sky promises. He did not offer that. He offered consistent returns, low volatility, but barely S&P 500 beating returns. So his cash lasted longer. The money he brought in, he wasn't paying out huge paydays for people. He was paying you 8%. And that made the cash last longer. So that extended the longevity of his fraud.
So there's a final. I think we have time for maybe one more question. What's your advice for journalists about cultivating a social media persona that doesn't turn off sources but also opens doors? I mean, this whole new world is really
it took
a challenging one.
Yeah, it took me. I'm still wrestling with that, and I'm learning about that from a lot of younger reporters who are very, very good at it. I've been somewhat hit or miss, but I think I've kind of come up with a formula now that works for me, which is to identify 2 or 3 areas where I've got a right to be heard. I mean, 2 or 3 areas about which I am an undisputed expert. I know a heck of a lot about journalism. I've spent a half century doing this.
Right.
So on journalism issues, I don't have any trouble expressing my views, getting engaged in the conversation. I know a heck of a lot about white collar crime and securities regulation. I've spent 30 years covering that. My views have valence. They're well grounded in history and experience, and I feel like I have a right to speak up on those issues. I've stepped across the line occasionally on gender equality issues, but I'm a feminist who came up on that uneven playing field, and I won't apologize about that. I do feel I can make my voice heard to support women journalists and other marginalized journalists, and try to help them be heard and to address the problems that I see in social media affecting them. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to identify some lanes that I can cruise in.
And so you don't just have to give like political opinions on something maybe that you aren't known to have studied, or just kind of.
Yeah. Now, I people will look at my Twitter feed and say, "Oh, that's a bunch of nonsense," and they're right. I don't always discipline myself on this front, but I do try. I mean, that is what I have tried to do. The ethical issues surrounding the idea of running a business out of the Oval Office dragged me kind of into the political realm, but my fundamental issue there was with the regulatory issue. You know, this is supposed to be a public service, not a private business. So, but I'm trying.
A final question from the front row seats is, how is financial journalism, business journalism doing now? Kind of give us your view. What are the strengths now? What are the weaknesses? Where can we do better?
I've spent a lot of time in the archives of the 1930s, and I can tell you we are immensely better than we used to be. They were a little more than stenographers back then. I'm really excited about the quality of current financial journalism. I really am. It survived that terrible dislocation in our business where, big city regional newspapers were just disbanding their business sections. City business journals are up and coming and very vital source of business news coverage. I bless the people running those every day. I think the biggest gain that I've seen, really, even almost since I retired from the Times, in the past almost decade now, is the emergence of financial journalism in lots of other kinds of beats. It isn't a silo anymore.
Right.
It truly is being it's spreading out to sports coverage, to welfare payment issues, to land use, to climate change. I mean, the disciplines, the sources, the documents that are part of being a financial journalist are being far more widely applied than they ever were when I first got.
I think that started, maybe not started, but certainly got a lot of impetus with the 2008 financial crash. I mean, there was all of a sudden there was an understanding of something that I would kind of go around the newsroom and at the Times and preach, not just in my department. It's almost always about money.
Yes. Yes.
And there was a money element and that it's going to, and the more you understand that, but it has to be sophisticated, the better you are going to explain what's going on in your corner of the world, whatever that corner is.
Absolutely.
Than you could before.
I absolutely agree.
I could keep going here. I could just keep listening to the both of you. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I don't want it to end. I go all night with this, but I know folks want to get to dinner. But I think both of you are responsible for bringing business news and financial news into the mainstream as well, just because of the broadness of how you've covered it, but also how you've just made it so digestible for others and been an inspiration to so many others. Diana, thank you for letting us honor you and being a part of our Legends of Business News conversation series. Larry, I couldn't think of a better person to have had this conversation with. Diana, you're a legend in your own right. We're going to get you up here soon enough. And as folks know, Diana was a recipient of our Distinguished Achievement Award. So is Larry. And Diana was also a former board member. 2 years ago, we lost one of our own board members, Shauna Antunes. She was a board member. She held executive editor roles at Fortune, at Quartz, at CNBC Digital, and CNNMoney.com. I got to work with her. What a wonderful person. Got to serve with her on the board. We've established a women's leadership program in her name, and we have some of the fellows here tonight on this conversation listening in. I'm sure they were so inspired by you, Diana, and we're delighted to have them here as well. If you want to find out more about the Shauna Fellowship or donate, please visit SABEW.org. Check out what's going on at SABEW. We got so many cool things cooked up. We have this conversation series. We have our webinar series that's ongoing. We have a cool spring conference in the works. We're hoping to get together and announce really soon here. We got our Best in Business awards being judged right now. A ton going on at SABEW. So check out SABEW.org. If you're not a member, reach out, join. We'd love to have you here. This is what we do. We honor the best and brightest in our industry. We're trying to help make business journalism better and stronger and longer lasting for everybody, so we can have more and more legends like Diana come and visit with us and share their story. So Diana, again, thank you so much for letting us have this conversation with you. And Larry, thank you for the conversation. And folks, thanks for joining us tonight.
Bravo to Diana.
Thank you, Larry.